So going off Charlie's introduction, I have found that perhaps due to my background, my perspectives and approach differ quite a bit from what can be considered sort of standard in the effective altruism or catastrophic risk long-termism community. But I've also found that, as I will call the deep green approach, actually combines several cross areas in effective altruism that tend to be treated separately. So I want to share with you today some of this perspective and how I think they might be helpful toward risk mitigation and moral good optimization. And I'll draw on some of my research to make examples along the way. And I want to say that I'm going to be using terms like the standard EA approach, and I just want to say upfront that I know that's very generalizing, but it's simply meant to refer to the most common views and approaches across this broader community. And I should also note that I'll be talking a lot about my own personal views today, which are not necessarily the views of the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute, where I work. Okay, so after a short introduction, I'll spend roughly the first half explaining what I mean by this deep green approach. And then in the second half, I'll focus more on how I think this approach can contribute. All right, so here are some core issues and concepts that I think most of you will recognize as central to our community. We care about maximizing good, well-being matters, the far future matters, preventing future moral catastrophes, mitigating extreme threats, enabling potential for good into the far future. So I'm on board with all of this, but what specifically is meant by these concepts? What exactly is good? What is well-being? And how do we measure it? Whose and what's well-being are we really talking about? What exactly do we think would be good in the far future? How do we define extreme risks and catastrophes, and so on? And my experience is that these questions tend to not really be scrutinized a lot in effective altruism, but rather that their answers are implied based on certain assumptions, assumptions that are grounded in specific disciplinary and traditions and theories, such as welfare economics, utilitarianism, and so on. So generally speaking, my approach differs in that I answer many of these questions differently than what is common across effective altruism. That said, my aim here today is not to advocate a particular moral theory. I put a great deal of emphasis on moral uncertainty, which I'll come back to. So my aim is rather to demonstrate that there are other ways to approach central issues and concepts in effective altruism, and that doing that may generate quite different answers. I think there's a lot of value to EA broadening and diversifying philosophical and moral approaches in order to find the best ways to mitigate risk and doing good. So I'll use my own current moral views as a case example, but I hope and think that people can draw insights from a lot of what I will say without having to adopt particular moral positions that I happen to have. Okay, so what do I mean by deep green? I think a lot of you are probably familiar with the idea of giving moral consideration to non-human animals, perhaps specifically sentient animals, perhaps grounded in the argument that what matters morally is the capacity to experience pleasure and pain. So this is one way of rejecting anthropocentrism, which is the factual and moral privileging of humans and human interests above everything else, just on grounds of being human. So deep green ethics, also called ecocentric ethics, it similarly rejects anthropocentrism, but it goes further than to morally consider individual sentient animals. So it's an ethic and really a worldview grounded in the sciences of the Earth system, and it sees moral value holistically in the total life system of planet Earth. So that's the total ecosphere and its story of life across deep time. So that includes concern for individual sentient animals, but also for all other forms of life, lineages of life over time, in other words, species, and also the systems of biotic and abiotic elements that make life and civilization possible through interdependent and symbiotic relationships. So independent of any utility for humans, all of this is considered to be of moral value. So that means it's also a value pluralistic view. It also differs from the approach of moral circle expansion, as it doesn't really take the human as the center or starting point of ethics, but it rather sees humans as one member of the planetary and ethical community. And the main reason to place moral value at this overarching holistic level is quite practically grounded. The well-being of the total system takes precedence because the well-being of everyone and everything else depends on it. So when human wants clash with the health of the Earth as a whole or any of its ecosystems, then the former should practically and ethically speaking give way to the latter. So this means that it's not enough to value other life and nature only for how it may benefit humans, or morally valuing it, but always less than humans, because that means that when there are conflicts of interests, it is morally justifiable to always give precedence to human interests. And that is not aligned with how the natural world actually functions. So this is essentially what human civilization has been doing for a while now, and that's an important part of why we are having a planetary environmental crisis, because the interest of everyone and everything else, including the planetary whole, has been disregarded. And secondly, a deep green approach is not only a moral view, but it's also a way of understanding and studying the world and human society through a deeply interdisciplinary lens and by applying an inherently big picture perspective. One of the founding principles of this line of thinking was articulated by Aldo Leopold in his 1949 Assam County Almanac. And the principle is to think like a man. So this means to step out of one's individuality and understand the world as an interconnected web across deep time. So it's a line of thinking that incorporates insights from political science, from anthropology, psychology, and economics, in addition to environmental sciences. Okay, so if we focus on the ethics side of the deep green approach first, let's have a second look at those central concepts that I mentioned earlier. If we start with the most fundamental one, what is good? Here, the effective altruism standard definition tends to be something like the greatest good for the greatest number of people, the happiness of the greatest number of people, or the welfare or positive subjective experience of individual sentient beings. And in contrast, I would say that what is good, what is most important, is something along these lines: the continuation, the welfare, and optimization of the total system and story of life on and from Earth, and its capacities for good. That includes human well-being, of course, but it's part of a bigger, more important story. So this means that, first of all, I find all instances of life, evolution, and creativity that this planet's natural systems have created and are creating are extraordinary and of moral value. It means that I find good to be relevant to more than humans. All life, both individual organisms and holistic entities such as species and ecosystems, have an innate drive to live and flourish, and they have interests, they have values, and they have well-being. It also means that I find it inherently, the inherently relational and symbiotic structure of the Earth-life system makes it difficult to single out certain entities or qualities or properties as a sole container for moral value. It also means that I find moral value in a diversity of these instances of life, evolution, and creativity. So that there is a variation, a type of richness in the types of beings and types of experiences that exist in the world or in the universe, that seems to matter morally. And as already mentioned, it means that the good of the whole must take precedence in order to take care of and ensure the goods of the parts, because the latter inherently depends on the former. And finally, it also means that non-humans can also do good. If we take the Amazon rainforest, for example, this is an entity that is producing an immense number and diversity of both intrinsic and instrumental values. And it's doing so over spatial and temporal scales that far outside the good that most individual humans are able to produce. So, for example, we may agree that a happy human being is typically a good thing, something of moral value, and thus all else equal, 10 happy humans might be better than one. But the reality is that all else is rarely equal. So the more humans, the better. It's not the case as long as those humans exist within a finite system, such as a planetary ecosphere. So on the contrary, in that case, it can be better to have fewer humans, for example, in order to better meet the interests of others and the health of the whole, which again secures the health of whatever humans are around. So in total, this means that I suspect that good is inherently qualitative. I think it's malleable over time, space, and context, which means that it's not always measurable or comparable or fungible. And that's why I'm also skeptical of the standard approach in effective altruism to sort of reduce morality to something that can be quantified. And it also means that I'm skeptical that there is one single good. I think many things are morally good, and the morality cannot and should not really be reduced to one sole thing. And if we look at research in moral psychology, for example, we can see that humans today find a whole variety of things to be morally good, including well-being, but also knowledge, truth, equity, love, beauty, being a good human, as well as non-human animals, wildlife, biodiversity, ecosystems, and so on. And with welfare or well-being, a lot of the same really applies. So here the sort of standard PA definition is typically something like the positive subjective experience or hedonism of humans or sentient beings. I take well-being to mean a little bit more general, to mean that which is good for an entity to have one's interests met. So positive subjective experience is part of that, but it's not all there is to well-being. And there's a common misconception about ecocentrism that goes something like, ecocentrism is indifferent to the welfare of individual humans or animals. They care about things like forests and rivers and not sentient beings. And ecocentrism is not in opposition to welfarism. So it's rather a matter of how we define welfare and whose and what's welfare we should care about. So as mentioned, I think well-being is relevant for all living organisms as well as for holistic entities and the planetary whole. And this also means that I think it's important to try and understand what well-being means for different beings and entities without incorporating human biases that grounds our understanding of well-being in human well-being. And importantly, a deep green understanding of well-being means that the well-being of any individual depends on the well-being of others, and it depends on the well-being of the greater system that the individual is part of. So taking care of an individual's well-being necessitates taking care of the broader context that inherently makes up that individual's well-being. So that also means that the well-being of individuals can only be optimized within the boundaries of what constitutes the well-being of the total system. So similarly to the previous example, how we define and pursue human welfare, for example, must be compatible with the welfare of the ecosphere. Otherwise, the welfare for humans cannot be met. And also when it comes to sentience and sort of standard notions of subjective well-being, I actually suspect that sentience or consciousness might be far more widespread than we tend to assume. I think it's possibly present more or less throughout the living world, not only inherent in so-called higher animals. For example, there's recent research that suggests that consciousness evolved progressively since the emergence of life on Earth. So that means that if that is the case, it might be present in some minimal sense in even the most primitive single-celled organisms. And there's other research, which is actually quite established by now, that demonstrates that plants, such as trees, they possess cognitive capacities such as learning, memory, communication, cooperation, and socialization. That doesn't necessarily imply that they are sentient, but I would not be surprised if advances in the science of consciousness would relatively soon show that they are. That said, I do think it's likely that different beings have different capacities for experiencing well-being and suffering. And I do think that matters morally, but I don't think that is all that matters morally. So taken together, this means that, again, I'm skeptical of approaches to quantify well-being and treat well-being as something that can be measured at weight as units. I think well-being across the world is inherently more complex than that. And I'm skeptical also of the idea that an entity's well-being can be separated from the entity's greater context. Another future focus area in effective altruism is future moral catastrophes. There's a quote here from Will MacAskill. And he says, what are the sorts of major moral problems that in several hundred years we'll look back and think, wow, we were barbarians? I will refer to this as cross-acts. I'm not aware of any standard idea of this across the EA, but it seems to me at least that not recognizing moral value across the rest of the ecosphere is one such cause-act, especially if it should prove that sentence is far more widespread than typically assumed. So this means that I think we're living in a moral catastrophe right now. I think for anyone who bothers to go out there and see what's going on in the wild and in factory farms and so on, it's rather obvious. So the memes and artworks that you see here, so the moral equivalent of what I think that we're doing to the rest of the planet. And beyond moral catastrophes are just catastrophes overall, in other words, existential and catastrophic risks, which are risks that threaten that which is of moral value in some total sense. And here the standard EA definition is typically either the extinction of the human species, or the destruction of humanity's long-term potential, or failure to reach technological maturity. So given that I find so much more than individual humans or instances of pressure to be of moral value, I naturally find catastrophic risks to be that which threatens much more, specifically that which threatens the existence, the continuation, the welfare, and the future moral potential of all life on Earth and the overall story of life that has happened on this planet. It also means that I think existential and catastrophic risks to humanity are relevant also due to the instrumental role of humans in protecting and advancing other life and its potential into the far future. So this affects my risk prioritization, for example. And first of all, although we tend to define all existential risks as being threats to humans only, but many of them are an equal threat to at least the majority of life on Earth, such as nuclear war and asteroid impacts. But for other risks, impacts are not equal. So for example, I think it's a greater value loss if the majority of Earth life goes extinct than if the human population is, relatively speaking, slightly reduced due to, say, a global pandemic. And this may evoke another common misconception about ecocentrism, which is that ecocentrists think that humans are bad and that human extinction would be a good thing. There are some people that hold this view. I think it's very rare. It's not really an ecocentric view. I personally think it would be a horrendous loss if humans went extinct. But I also think it would be a horrendous loss if humans went on into the far future, but the rest of Earth life had been lost on the way, no matter how many future humans we're talking about. I think it's also worth pointing out that it's equally true that for at least 900 species, which is probably a massive underestimate, human impacts on environment constitutes already unfolded existential risks. Like what we fear for ourselves have already happened to them. So in sum, I obviously think extreme risks are relevant to much more than the human species or any descendants of the human species. And on the other side, the catastrophic risks are the long-term potential for moral value across time and space. And here the standard EA definition is typically the maximum number of happy humans or sentient beings or digital minds. I also think that the long-term future matters a great deal due to this opportunity space for moral value. I think we're still at a very early stage in the possible timeline of life from Earth. So I think there's a lot of potential for good in the future. But my intuitions about why that future can be really good is less about maximizing numbers of beings that exist, and more about a qualitatively big opportunity space. I personally find it too speculative to sort of confidently define today what optimal moral value may come to mean in the far future. But since I find more than humans and more than subjective happiness to be of moral value, I see the basis for moral potential to likewise be a much bigger pool. So I see that the total ecosphere and the creative forces in nature constitutes really the total existing pool of opportunities for producing moral goods into the future. And remember that humans and our inventions are part of that, but it means that we should also be concerned about the long-term future and potential of other living beings and systems. In short, I don't think the future is ours alone. And I think that doing that will actually advance also a better future for us or for our descendants. I think continuing to live in a rich, living and flourishing world is better for us. And I think it makes us better people than pursuing a future that is really only about ourselves or our own happiness. There's also really immense scientific evidence that experiencing and interacting with nature and non-humans is really essential to human well-being. So I think pursuing overall moral potential across time and space can include increasing the number of beings that exist and have happy lives. But it could also include things like increasing knowledge about the universe or about morality, increasing diversity of beings that exist. It could include enhancing our own moral characters, improving equity, advancing love, empathy, artistic creativity, and so on. All the things that give life not only happiness, but also meaning. And I worry that failing to do so, failing to pursue a long-term value optimization based on a broad spectrum of what is or can be of moral value, may potentially turn out to be the equivalent of sort of irreversibly closing the door on a massive moral opportunity space. And one of my focus areas in my own research has been on applying environmental perspectives to space colonization, or space expansionism, as I prefer to call it. So let me draw an example from that. Expanding into space is typically seen as part of the process to optimize moral value into the far future. And most accounts of expanding into space paint a picture of humans somewhat detaching from the rest of the ecosphere and going out there more or less on our own. Whereas an ecocentric perspective on space expansion aims to, first of all, promote the totality of the story of life on Earth throughout space. It emphasizes the instrumental role of having a technologically advanced civilization to that end. And it considers a diversity and optimization of sort of Earth-like worlds throughout space-time to be central to moral goods optimization. And you can find this case made in more detail in my paper called Greening the Universe. And I know that there are some that worry that spreading Earth life in space can pose immense suffering risks. But I think the conclusion from that should not be to leave the rest of Earth life behind, but rather to ask, how can we assure that that will not be the case? How can we ensure that the future is also good for non-humans? Okay. I hope that made it a bit clear how I view and approach some of these sort of central concepts in effective altruism. And even if you disagree with many or all of my perspectives, I still hope that thinking about them can help us as a group acknowledge and consider a greater variety of perspectives than what is currently done. Because after all, we are claiming to work on issues that are on behalf of everyone and everything, and which we claim are the absolute most important issues, period. So then I think we owe it to the rest of the world to have a sort of open and humble mind. So let's move on to more pragmatic considerations of how this approach might contribute to risk mitigation and to advancing moral goods. So we could first just summarize sort of what I've said so far. A deep green approach means One, prioritizing immediate threats to the ecosphere, which outcome will impact other extreme risks and future trajectories. It also means considering impacts on the rest of the ecosphere when studying other global catastrophic risks. And it means accounting for the well-being and interest of the rest of the ecosphere in pursuit of good long-term futures. So the way I see it, this actually means that a deep green approach is one that combines several cross areas of effective altruism. It incorporates human and non-human welfare, catastrophic risks, moral progress, and expanded altruism beyond who we today happen to believe are sentient. And it also reconciles near-term concerns with long-term concerns. I also find that this inherently interdisciplinary and big picture perspective, or the deep green approach, actually fits very well to the equally interdisciplinary study of catastrophic risks and future moral potential. In short, if we study risks and ethics from the perspective of only one or a few disciplines, I think it's very unlikely that we will be able to find viable solutions and answers. And this interdisciplinarity also aligns well with a systemic way of thinking about risks and the future. So if we take mitigating risks from climate change and environmental destruction as an example, from a technological perspective, the solution might be to transfer to clean energy. From an economic perspective, perhaps the solution is to incentivize green growth. And this can be important measures, but they don't paint the whole picture, and they don't address the underlying systemic causes of the problem. And one major insight from deep green line of thinking is that dominant ontological and ethical paradigms over the past few centuries, especially in the so-called Western world, have been one important such underlying cause that has helped enable and justify our collective behavior towards the natural world. That includes, for example, conceptualizing everything besides humans as essentially dead matter, as resources that can be monetized and consumed, as property, and thus of no moral importance. If the rest of nature had been seen as alive, as having interests, as interdependent as siblings, it would have been much harder to establish social and economic systems that were based on their exploitation. So in other words, human ways of thinking and valuing seem to have played a central role in enabling at least one catastrophic risk. So more generally, the world looks the way it does today, among other things, because a whole bunch of such paradigms of thoughts, be it industrialism, capitalism, imperialism, and so on. And I think we have a much better chance at mitigating risks if we understand and address the underlying systems that cause them. I think that human moral values is one such system, which is why I've chosen to focus on that. And it's also a reason why I don't think that technology, for example, can solve any possible problem, or that donating money is a long-term solution to a problem. There. All right, so let's take a closer look at the moral case for practically applying a deep green approach. First of all, as far as we know, what has happened on Earth, this astonishing, diverse, and living world, is cosmically extraordinary. I think that on its own really gives us good reason to value its totality rather than singling out only a fraction of it. We are also very, very far away from having sort of complete knowledge and understanding about this planet. For example, some estimates consider that 90% of species aren't even discovered yet. So it seems exceptionally premature to me to sort of discard value across the natural world at this point. And likewise, from sort of deep time perspective, it seems quite absurd to me to deny any moral value to in every being and systemic process that through time has enabled our own existence and everything we care about, including our capacity for moral contemplation. And secondly, and relatedly, I think that moral uncertainty and the prospect of moral progress actually give us reasons to promote a radically inclusive ethic. And that's especially the case when we're considering long-term trajectories. It's just a couple of centuries ago, human slavery and denying women to vote were considered perfectly moral behavior. Today, more and more people are seeing what we are doing to other animals as morally barbaric. In not too long, perhaps the same will be the case across the plant kingdom. So taking a sort of inclusive moral position means taking seriously the precautionary principle to future moral catastrophes. And thirdly, even if the ecocentric perspective should prove to be completely wrong, it seems to me that there is way more potential moral loss from excluding moral consideration of the rest of Earth now than from including it. There seems to be very few reasons not to give a great variety of entities moral consideration, such as insects and plants, even if it feels fringe, then and good reasons to do so, as we just mentioned, moral uncertainty. And there's also a case to be made that the ecocentric perspective is not really fringe at all. There are varieties of it that are held by many different indigenous peoples around the world. And historically speaking, it seems like animistic and more nature-centered views have been much more common across human history than today's human-centered views. Fourthly, the ecocentric view helps us to look at humanity also in instrumental terms. How can we contribute to the greater story that we are part of? Instead of focusing on ourselves somehow being the center of that story. We might not be that, and that might be a good thing, or it might not be important that we are. And from that perspective, it makes more sense to protect and promote the entire world that we are part of, and a variety of things in it that seems good, in order to maximize the potential for good in the future. One can also make a moral case based only on human welfare. As long as we remain biological beings, humans need a healthy ecosphere, and we are happier in it. And I think even if we become post-human, we might still be better off and happier living in and interacting with a healthy and flourishing environment. Sixth, there is research that shows that there are correlations between humans holding morally sympathetic views towards non-human animals and nature, also holding other morally progressive views, such as being politically liberal, having utilitarian views on human race, gender, and sexual orientation, for example. So this means that taking an ecocentric approach can join forces with progressive socio-political efforts towards shaping a good future. And finally, advancing a more inclusive moral worldview is likely to set us or our descendants in a better position to adequately give moral consideration to future beings, such as sentient AI, synthetic life forms, digital minds, or biology technology hybrids, for example. All right. Let's look a bit closer at how the deep green approach can contribute to risk mitigation. So I already mentioned the benefits from interdisciplinarity and systemic understanding. And first of all, a deep green understanding helps us to realize that how we resolve or fail to resolve the current environmental situation inherently impacts other risks, and it will really determine any future trajectories. And we have quite strong confidence in what the immediate future looks like. There will be more frequent and severe droughts, floods, heat waves, probably famines, mass migrations, further mass extinction, and so on. As we speak, a third of Pakistan is underwater. All of Europe's waterways have dried up. And this is the present reality. So a coming ecologically and socially disrupted world, that can mean technological stagnation, it can mean global war, it could mean extreme social polarization, lack of cooperation. That could include the collapse of multinational institutions. It could involve outbreaks of new pandemics, but then without the social, political, and economic systems to manage them, and so on. So we need to ground risk and future-oriented work in the present and the immediate future. And we need to figure out how exactly are we going to get from the present to the future that we want to enable. For example, I'm sympathetic to many of the arguments for AI risk. I work on AI myself, but I've seen very little work that places future AI in the context of the current environmental reality. The development of AGI or superintelligence is not a siloed trajectory on which the otherwise state of the world has no effect. Likewise, there's currently nothing that points to humans or our technologies being able to decouple from the ecosphere and the laws of nature in the foreseeable future. And the same goes for visions of any optimal long-term future. For example, if that entails the maximization of hyperhumans, perhaps determined on continued economic growth or resource consumption, then we need to make explicit how that future can come about from the present reality and what we know about the immediate future. So having a deep understanding can help us understand other risks in their greater context and make it clear that really anything and everything we might care about depends on a planetary environment that is able to sustain life and preferably civilization. And relatedly, and due to this interdisciplinary nature, a deep green understanding can also help us understand the complexities of risk. That can, for example, help us to avoid future anthropocentric fallacies. If we take biosecurity, for example, the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic was also linked to the morally justified systems of exploiting and imposing on the non-human world for human ends. So not accounting for such dynamics can increase the risk of future pandemics. And another example here is from my own research on AI ethics. Together with colleagues, I've found that AI ethics to date are overwhelmingly anthropocentric. I worry that designing and applying AI, including aligning advanced AI by anthropocentric values, can really exacerbate environmental and thus also human harms, potentially to catastrophic extent. That can be through non-human algorithmic biases. It can be failing to account for the environmental footprint of AI systems, or it could be to align an AGI system to values that fail to account for non-human animal welfare or social ecological interdependencies and so on. All right, so what might be effective measures to advance the deep green approach? Given that ideas that I've outlined here today have not really been explored in an effective altruism context, I unfortunately can't really point to robustly developed strategies, but I can mention some preliminary ideas about what I think might be good ways to go forward. I hope that others will be interested in helping out in developing more robust strategies. And one approach that I think can be valuable, which is not really widely explored, is value spreading, which is sort of pushing progressive moral values. That can take a systemic approach, focusing on impacting policy, educational systems and culture, or it can take a more targeted approach, focusing on changing the values of powerful individuals. Their values are arguably really key determinants for how the future will go. And this is unfortunately especially the case today, as power is really being increasingly centralized in the hands of the few. So work toward impacting the values and views of the next generation, for example, seems promising toward advancing more systemic and robust change, for example, by developing widely applicable resources for primary education, whereas impacting the values of key individuals might be relatively easier and can probably be achieved faster. I think that impacting the values of people that are developing or making decisions about advanced AI may be especially important. And also from a risk perspective, we might not have the time for widespread systemic change. But on the other hand, if a catastrophe unfolds but do not lead to human extinction, then the relevant generations might still benefit from having developed their views when they're dealing with a post-catastrophe world. I actually think that effective altruism is in a really good position to do work on both types of value spreading. A more traditional way that one can advance a deep green approach is through policy impact, for example, on environmental and animal law, on the protection of key ecosystems, or on family planning. I also think that efforts to scale up traditional and nature-based practices could be valuable. really some of the most effective environmental measures that we have are also among the simplest and cheapest ones, like rewilding efforts. I would welcome any effective altruism efforts that emphasize sort of cooperation with Earth systems toward risk mitigation. Earth as a planet has a lot of knowledge and experience on dealing with risks and being resilient. So we probably have a lot to learn from it. And ensuring that more people have sort of sufficient skills in traditional ways of living off nature could also be really valuable in a post-catastrophe scenario. A more controversial path that might be suitable for the more technically inclined is to help develop technological tools to advance communication with other beings. I know that the Earth Species Project is studying the use of AI to this effect. Another part could be to advance research into non-human sentience and consciousness. Breakthroughs there could really have wide impacts on policy and on consumer habits, for example. Obviously, applying deep insights to the study and development of AI and to AI safety research seems particularly crucial. And currently, very, very few people are really working on the intersection of AI and environment at all. And finally, I would love to see really fundamental research into what it might mean to do good effectively if good is taken to mean something else than commonly assumed, as outlined here today. For example, we can look into how non-human agents are doing good, as with the Amazon rainforest example. Not only should the concept of non-humans doing good make us consider what kind of moral status we give to other beings, but also how we can ourselves best contribute to doing good. Perhaps an individual human can do the most good by helping the Amazon rainforest do its good, for example. So this means seeing the human more as an intermediary agent, working together with other beings and entities towards good optimization. I think research that looks into this could be very valuable, and that does not really hinge on any specific moral framework. I think I'll leave it at that. Just gonna leave this summing up points hanging there. Thank you for listening. There's some questions, but also feel free to reach out to me at some later points. I'll be happy to chat or share resources and any other things that I've talked about. Thank you.
Andrea, thanks very much. All right, so we have time for some questions and answers. If you'd like me to read out your question, please just pop it in the chat. Otherwise, we will do it. We will do it through the hand raising. We have one person whose hand is raised so far, and that is Paul Ingram. So feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question, and then don't forget to mute yourself again.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Andrea. It's been a few months. Hey.
Hi.
Paul Ingram from the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk in Cambridge. And I've got a couple of questions, but before I do, I want to thank you, Andrea, because it's so rare to come across somebody who resonates with me in quite this way. For those that don't know, I used to be a Green Party politician in Oxford and was very much of the deep green end of the political spectrum. I wanted to start with a question around sentience and consciousness, because the implication of your talk is that it is only limited to live things, and ecosystems made up of live things and habitats. And I wondered if you're looking at things from a systemic perspective, the habitat is part of the thing that keeps life going. And given how little we know of consciousness and sentience and the link between the physical and the mental experience, if that's already limiting the concept, is there strong evidence to rule out non-living things as having sentience? That will sound weird to some people, but But you know, we're in the place of the fringe, and some of us have lived there for some decades. I really like the idea of humility in our judgments. I think that's really, really important. And my final question is, some of the conversations that you're dealing with there remind me in the political sphere of the debate between communitarianism and individualism. And I wonder if there is something to be said for looking at the way in which particularly cultures like the Chinese deal with the human anthropocentric approach in breaking down the atomization of society in the political sphere. And perhaps there are lessons to be learned there in applying it to the ecosphere. Just a thought.
Thank you. I'll start with the sentience first. No, I don't think there's strong evidence at all. I mean, the truth is that we had no idea really, like, you know, what is sentience or consciousness, or like, we can't even agree on what the concepts mean. So even if it's, yeah, I'm sure it feels super fringe to a lot of people today, but I definitely prefer to take a much more precautionary stand and be open to the fact that, yeah, perhaps sentience can even function in, you know, holistic entities. There's been a lot of research in like forestry that, you know, it's not specifically on sentience, but it demonstrates, for example, how a forest very much functions as a society. You know, like the elder trees take care of the younger trees and so on. Like there's a whole lot going on, and you know, this is happening through this sort of fungi networks underground. So yeah, the truth is, like, we don't know what these concepts are and how something like sentience emerged in nature. So I think it's very, very premature to assume that it's only limited to a few types of beings. And this is, I mean, even the process of doing that is also something, it's, you know, it's not based in science, it's based in humans' traditions of thinking. And we have had, especially in Western science, this tendency to sort of take the human as a starting point, as some type of standard, and then study the rest of the world in relation to the humans. So we study other animals and beings based on how do they measure up to us, how do they compare to us, and they need to sort of prove themselves to have whatever capacities we think that we have. So it's a whole sort of backward way of thinking, instead of just assuming that we know that, you know, humans are part of nature as everything else. We're not supernatural in any way. So if we think that we have all these capacities, then that probably comes from nature. So I think it makes much more sense to assume that similar capacities are present throughout sort of the life sphere and has developed through evolutionary processes. And the second question, yes, I realized that I actually didn't speak about that in terms of the difference between individual and community. And that's a big aspect of the sort of deep green way of thinking that is much more community oriented. I think the individualism that we're seeing in our societies today are very harmful, also to ourselves as beings. As all other life and all other species, we are social and sort of part of systems and part of communities. And I think we have lost a lot there. I'm not aware of any research that's used to just fall in terms of looking at China as an example. But I would be very interested to look more into that. Yes, see a lot of hands.
All right, thanks. I don't know if it's Martina herself, but I see that there's a table full of excited people in Trondheim. So if there's someone in Trondheim who had any question, now's your time.
All right. First of all, thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. I did wonder, all the illustrations, they are absolutely amazing. Do you make them yourself, or where do you get them from?
So I've not made the individual, like this leaf, for example, I've not made that. But I'm actually educated as an artist from before. Like I've spent the first 25 years of my life in doing art and music. So I do enjoy like making nice presentations, but I can't take credit for the details.
It's very nice. And I also wanted to say that I think it's fantastic that we're getting some rather fundamental new perspectives on value that I think are like not necessarily that much discussed in the community. So I think that's great. That being said, I disagree quite strongly with most of what's being said here, except for perhaps the precautionary principle. And I do have some questions. I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to get at some of the more fundamental. So I think one thing I'm wondering about is, I guess relatedly, how central sentience and perception is to the view that you are presenting here. So, for example, are some of the values? So you have some quotes here, like maximizing the things that seem good, etc. Are those independent of anyone actually experiencing those things? So, for example, inequality was mentioned. Would you say that inequality matters morally if it is not experienced by anyone? So if you have like, let's say 4 people in population A that are unequal in some sense in welfare, and then you have population B where everyone is equal, and however the average value in both populations is the same, but all the individuals are isolated, so none of the individuals know that they are in an unequal system. They have no perception or no like conscious experience of that inequality. Would you say that's just an example of like a value being perceived or actually being like consciously experienced versus it just not being consciously experienced? Is it critical for the argument that these values are actually experienced or not?
I don't think it's necessarily critical for the argument, but I definitely think there's a big difference between those two examples. So yes, I would say it matters a great deal. With this example of equity, that there will be subjects that would experience it as such. If the case is well, that's not the case, then you kind of get to sort of meta level of whether things like, yeah, equity and like, I mean, what does even equity mean if there is no experience? I have a paper under review at the moment, which deals with this in terms of diversity, which kind of, it's not exactly the same, but it's similar, where we're looking into, is there any intrinsic value to diversity as such, even if there's no experience of it, like just a variation of entities existing in the universe, for example. And that's like, it's very hard to morally sort of reason about those types of things, because in the end, we really only have our intuitions. I have like kind of weak intuition that all else equal, diversity, for example, matters morally, but then there are other things that matters much, much more. So yeah, I don't know if that's answered your question.
Yeah, that is exactly what I'm asking. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. All right, and now we have Ariel from Romania, if I'm correct.
Yes. Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask, I mean, if I understand correctly, you were saying that, as you were saying also just now, that there are other things like, for example, diversity that matter morally, things that are not only the experience of sentient entities. And what it's not clear to me what this means. I was wondering if you have an example of a situation in which this view of yours, this sort of ecosystem-centered moral philosophy conflicts with a more sentience-based moral philosophy, because sometimes to me it seems like it's different languages to talk about the same thing, because at the end of the day the prescriptions are very similar. At the end of the day, people who focus on sentience still ascribe instrumental value to diversity and to ecosystems and non-sentient habitats and non-sentient things. So do you have examples of situations in which there is a conflict?
Yeah, I just want to say first that I agree, and I think I really prefer to, like kind of find common grounds. Like if we all care about, life and sentient beings and so on, like that's what's really important. It's not like really finding where do we disagree. But I think, where it matters in reality is where you have specific conflicts of interest, right? So if, let's say, if the only moral principle you have to go after is that sentience matters, then my view, for example, if you have, let's say you have two different species and you have, or two different specimens of two different species, and the one is the trillionth number of that species and the other one is the last one, then my view can, give precedence to the one that is the last member, because that one dying is a bigger moral loss because it represents a whole lineage of life. So it provides a matter of solving that type of conflict. Whereas if you only say that, well, they are of equal worth because they're both individual sentient beings, then you might not have a measurement to solve that conflict. I don't know if that was a good example, but.
Yeah, I mean, I would reduce it somehow to, I would say that losing a species has repercussions that will affect the imbalanced ecosystems and it eventually cause suffering. This would be the argument that I would bring up in this situation. I don't know if it's good enough, but in all cases, but yeah, I see your point. Thanks.
All right, and now we have Anna.
Hello, this is Simon speaking from Anna's computer. Thanks for the presentation. I'm not sure if I understood things correctly, but I have one question. So like you mentioned that we should look at well-being, that it might be hard to quantify firstly, but also that we should care about the well-being of like the whole system rather than just the individuals. And I was wondering if you could like elaborate on like what would it look like for a system to have a lot of well-being? And if you compare that to the example of, I don't know, a classical forest where you have foxes and rabbits and, they sort of fluctuate in population size and, would that be an example of a system not having much well-being because a lot of individuals suffer due to the natural causes of things, or yeah, how would that look like?
So no, that would not mean that the forest is not having well-being. So like many things will then play in. As I said, like I also think sentience matters, or it matters like how are the entities or the beings in that forest doing. But there are also other principles going on in an ecological system, like there are principles of symbiosis, for example. So it can be, like if there's greater symbiosis, maybe that contributes to the well-being and also the good sort of production or optimization of the ecosystem. And if you have like, okay, if the individual beings that are also intrinsically valuable, then perhaps there is greater well-being of the system or greater more good optimization if there is a greater diversity of beings. So I think, like different environmentalists differ here. Like some will say that, an ecosystem should be, for example, protected exactly the way it is. But if you compare two different ecosystems, like a desert is also an ecosystem, whereas like, say, the Amazon rainforest, as I talked about earlier, there are two different ecosystems. But I think the rainforest is a better ecosystem. Like it contains and produces more moral goods. So all else equal, I think it's a good thing to turn the desert into an ecosystem rather than to preserve the desert. So that's a matter of like sort of adding up all of the different, like the point here is that it's a value pluralistic view, right? So you need to like add up all the different considerations. How are the beings doing? How many beings are there? What is the diversity of beings? What is the symbiosis between the beings? And maybe also like, you know, what other goods are the ecosystem producing for beings that are outside the system, for example, such as humans. So, you know, yes, did that answer your question?
Amazing. Thank you very much. That's what I was looking for.
Thank you.
Okay. Now we have, I'm sorry, I'm not going to say your name properly, but Huji?
Thank you. This is Huizi from Stockholm. I just missed that part. I think you mentioned something about China or Chinese, and it would be really interesting to understand what you were explaining. Can you please, if you don't mind, to repeat what was your point?
Yeah, unfortunately, that was not my point. It was not part of the presentation. It was the first question that popped up by Paul Ingram. I don't know if Paul is still here. If you want to.
Yes, I'm here. Yeah. So basically I was saying that from a Western perspective, we often take things as a very individualistic approach, and what Andrea was talking about in her talk was very communitarian in approach, looking at things from an ecosystem perspective, and that perhaps we have, particularly over here in the West, something to learn from the debate in political science between individualism and communitarianism. That was what I was saying.
Okay, and that has something to do with China or I don't know, Chinese point of view, or
yeah, the Chinese have the Chinese culture is very much closer to the communitarianist approach.
I see, but very well. Thank you for your explanation.
Was there anything else, Wuji?
No, that was my curiosity, but thank you very much for the explanation.
Thank you. Okay, next we have Timon.
Yeah, so I have two short moral examples where I would like your opinion on, and then one more general question. So first, assuming you have two different ecosystems, and they are both biodiverse and flourishing and healthy in a way, but in one of those ecosystems, the beings suffer more for some reason. It's harder for them to endure in those ecosystems. Would you say there's any difference in the moral good? Because I mean, it's both biodiverse, flourishing ecosystems, or does it make a difference what the experience is of those beings in those ecosystems?
Yes, definitely. I mean, subjective well-being is very, very important. So that's, as I said, like there's a kind of misconception about ecocentrism that we don't care about well-being. I don't think there's any reasonable moral theory that doesn't care about well-being of any sentient life. So that's very, very important. The point is just that it's not everything that matters, or that, as I said, like well-being is also sort of dependent on a greater context.
Okay, so then this was easy. Second question, assuming we discuss the existence of a being like a parasite, and that parasite has no benefit for the ecosystem, except it increases the suffering of other beings. Like, for instance, we have a parasite which makes human life more miserable, and we might assume that the parasite itself doesn't really have a deep conscious experience. Is it a good thing that we have this parasite because it adds biodiversity?
If that would be the case, if there's such a thing, no, then probably the moral bads it's inflicting, weighs heavier than the moral goods of it being one adding one number to the biodiversity calculus, for example. So it's the same with like the diversity example. So it's like all else equal, maybe it has like some amount of moral value, but you know, as you said, if it's contributing in a very negative way to a lot of other different things that are moral value, then that can, you know, push it out.
Okay. And lastly, correct me if I'm wrong, but I understood that you said you can't measure well-being. So it's more like a qualitative approach rather than a quantitative approach, right?
Yes.
So my question would be, how can you make difficult moral decisions without some kind of qualitative assessment?
That's what makes ethics so difficult, right? It's it's not that we can't, you know, ever quantify it, but like well-being and other things of moral value are, I think, so much more complex that it's easy if we apply very simplistic quantitative methods that we're making mistakes or, you know, making a lot of assumptions. And in some scenarios, maybe that's not a big deal, but we're talking about catastrophic risks. We're talking about moral potential of the universe. We have to be super careful. So I think having a more kind of humble view towards, you know, what are the concepts we're talking about and how do we approach them is really, really important. It's not to say that like quantification is always bad or something, like, of course not. But I don't think it can be applied in a simple way to everything, no, including well-being.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Thanks for the questions.
Thanks, Simon. It looks like we have another question from Sweden, and I can't promise that it's.
Ville here, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes, hi, Villa.
Thank you. So this is, I don't, it's a very speculative question, but if anyone has thought about this, it seems like you would be the person, Andrea. So I think there's something interesting going on when I talk about space exploration with people who I would consider environmentalists, where they seem to be quite hesitant, think it's a bad thing at face value. And there's like a tension for me there in that I think like, so if you care about life, like, doesn't it seem like a good thing? And like maybe the most important thing we could do as human species, that we're like in some kind of unique position there to like bring life to the rest of the universe. And I can feel like some frustration there. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I've been in so many discussions on this. It's, yeah, and I honestly, like, I kind of been there myself, because it's like different environmental views. And a lot of the environmental opposition to space expansionism this is complex, because it's kind of mixed up with the space discourse and sort of narrative of space exploration that's going on now, and how that is inherently linked to like colonialism and capitalism and stuff like that, that there's a lot of opposition to. So people are worried that like we're going out into space based on the wrong values, based on the wrong attitudes, with this kind of same exploitative mindset. So a lot of environmentalists are concerned that we're going to go to like other planets and kind of do the same as we've done to Earth, or like have this reckless behavior. And like, I'm sympathetic to those kind of concerns as well. But that's one of the reasons why I pulled up the Greening the Universe paper that I wrote, because those type of views are rare, like applying this kind of let's, you know, optimize or maximize what's good into space from like an environmental perspective. That's just very rarely done. So that's what I'm doing in that paper, is like arguing exactly what you said now, that like, if what is really a moral value is, you know, life and diversity and all this stuff, then why not, like, then maybe that's what we should do, like optimize that throughout space. But that comes in conflict with other environmental values, like, oh, we should let other planets be as they are, like we have no right to go there and sort of push our ideas and values onto other planets. So there's a lot of like, there's conflict between different environmental views, and I sort of sympathetic to both sides. But again, if there's a situational like weighing, you know, what's most important or what matters the most or what has the most value, then I do think that we can morally justify bringing Earth life for humans and everything to other planets. But I hope we can do it in like a less anthropocentric and exploitative way as we've done on Earth. But you know, if you compare Earth to a planet that has no life, yeah, I think Earth is a better place and like has more moral value. Thus, maybe it would be a good thing to like turn other planets into like Earth-like planets, right? But it's like, yeah, as you said, like a lot of environmentalists really react to that because it's also this extremely violent act, kind of, to like take a whole planet and like we're gonna change it in our own image. So maybe I'm wrong about that, but like, yeah, it's you have picked up on very heated debates. Yes.
Thank you for that very good answer. I have another like hard question maybe, but just you mentioned AI in this context, and I would just be like, are there any examples of, or do you have any thoughts about like what would be the best ways or some good ways to be like shaping or using AI to be like holistically beneficial for the planet?
Yeah, like in my own research so far, like we've, as I said, because basically no people have been working on this, we've sort of started on a very fundamental level and just looking at like sort of arguing that, okay, you know, we need to dedicate AI projects to doing environmental good, or we need to account for environmental footprints of AI, which are enormous. As I mentioned, looking into like algorithmic biases, there's a lot of research on that, but only on social biases. But like even the English language is like inherently anthropocentric. So even like the way we talk about nature and non-human animals and so on is really discriminatory. So that's obviously going to be replicated through AI. Already is, probably. AI ethics principles and like for governance, like just getting those kind of considerations in there is like tedious work that I'm doing. Because like they can actually really make a difference. So the first steps are really just to like make the case, and it's not, you know, it's not because I think that people are trying to avoid giving consideration to nature or something, but you know, this, I have to talk to a lot of like computer scientists, you know, they're not trained in ethics, they're not trained in environmental science. Like we need to kind of build bridges between the different disciplinaries to understand each other and like how can we incorporate environmental concern, for example, in AI design. Like I'm talking to people at Chai, like Stuart Russell and these guys, like what are the methods that they are developing in terms of value alignment, for example, what do they imply for accounting for non-human interests and values? Are the methods that they are developing even suitable to get sort of concern for non-humans into the system? So there's a lot of like really preliminary work that I think is very important because the implications are massive. Yeah, I forgot if I answered your question.
You answered it fantastically. Yeah, I'd be curious to see a write-up of this. I think many people will resonate with this perspective. But thank you very much, Andrea.
Thanks. All my AI papers you can find at my website or at the GTRI website.
Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. Okay, I'm going to take the privilege of being the chair and ask my own questions now. I have one. I would like to do a role play, Andrea. And I was wondering if you could perhaps kind of out loud think like a mountain for us.
Are you serious?
Or if that's too much, if you could tell, like, I'm very curious. I was trying to imagine what thinking like a mountain would be, and I found it a little difficult. So I was wondering if you could give us like an example of what thinking like a mountain might be, at least for you in any case. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I don't know if I can do the role playing part, but I can give an example at least. We tend to naturally experience the world through us as human beings. But if you imagine being a mountain, then, for example, your conception of time is completely different than from how it is for a human. And this, I can draw an example from the space exploration discourse again. People will, for example, argue that the moon doesn't have any value because it's just like static environment. It's just a big ball of rock. But if you look through a different time lens, if you're a mountain or if you're the moon yourself, it's actually like it's changing throughout time. Like it has its own kind of creative processes and all kinds of things going on. But we can't perceive that because it's in different, like it operates on different levels than we do. Yeah, that's one example.
Okay, thank you. So part of my question though would be is do you think that there's is all value then found in what we would call like life? So is like carbon-based life where we find the idea of good and value, or is there other intrinsic parts of nature that have their own inherent goodness as well? So an example of this is kind of an old callback, but like in the Red Mars trilogy, you have people like the Reds, who were people who were colonists in Mars, who did not like the idea of really humans being there, period, because they found that there was some intrinsic goodness or value in Martian life as it was, even if there wasn't any Martian life. And so, I mean, there was no carbon life there, but they found that there was intrinsic goodness in just the chemical, I guess, the existence of Mars as it is. Do you find any truth in that, or do you think that it's carbon life and a sort of panpsychism that is necessary for there to be any moral value?
I like panpsychism. No, I don't think life being carbon-based is what gives it moral value. Maybe we'll go on to leave the carbon world behind and so on, and I don't think that's really important. It's the current reality of like life on Earth, so you can kind of ground it in that. But in terms of extraterrestrial life, which is the example you're giving, it's a different scenario, because then you're talking about you're talking about two different origins of life, and there's two different origins of moral value or moral value judgment. So there's an inherently different scenario than talking about what kind of ethics are we Earthlings going to adopt. So like, if Earth life were to encounter extraterrestrial life, maybe the right thing to do would be to like resolve moral conflicts based on some, like political democratic processes, for example, because maybe they are inherent to their moral views and moral rights just as much as we are. But I think there's a case to be made that like for us as Earthlings, at least in the sort of present time that we're able to conceptualize, then we can kind of be morally forgiven for prioritizing ourselves and like our own total story, or like what came from Earth. That doesn't mean that if we were to encounter extraterrestrial life, we would have the right to just like walk all over it. But again, like then if there would be like a conflict where that was the only option, maybe that could be justified. Like if that was like the only two options, like, okay, we're gonna sacrifice ourselves or we're gonna kill the Martians, then I would probably say let's kill the Martians. But like if we don't have to, no, then let's not. That's also life or something else that could be of moral value. So yeah, it's like two different things. One is like what ethics does it make sense for us from Earth to have, and what do we do in a scenario that there are other sort of value sources in the universe. I also have a paper on that coming out, but I don't know if I'm even allowed to talk about it yet. It's coming. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. That was very interesting. I just wanted to, there was a question from someone named Marcus asking about how you reject quantitative reasoning. How do you know what one action is better than another? And I know you spoke briefly about that kind of in the abstract or in the philosophical, but I would be curious how you personally make choices or how you define moral questions. If you decide that if you say that they're qualitative, if morals or values are qualitative in nature, how do you kind of on a personal level make decisions about what it has value? Right? Because in the end, it kind of comes down to all of us having to make our own decisions if it's qualitative. Or even in a quantitative nature, we have to kind of decide what our measurements are. So what is your life hack around this?
Yeah, and I don't think that if that's really about like whether you have a quantitative or qualitative approach. I mean, I generally try to have this like framework as I presented today in the back of my mind, like, is what I'm doing sort of advancing the planetary whole as a good. But I don't know, can anyone think of an example of like a situation that, Elliot really wants to do that? Because go ahead.
Okay. Yes. So yeah, I think this is a great question. I think that all of the utilitarians in the audience are wondering. Timon touched on it. Yeah. So I think just very quickly, the reason why I think this is important is because some will say that we are making trade-offs every day, and so the answer of like, oh, I just don't make trade-offs just isn't an answer, right? Like when you buy an iPhone, you make a trade-off. When you do we support electric cars? Do we, the mineral use? There's trade-offs everywhere, right? And basically you're making a choice when you buy an iPhone that your welfare is more important than people in poor countries, right? Because we know that we could do much more good by giving the money elsewhere. So a perfect example of this, I guess, is like in my head, imagine there's two lawnmowers, right? And they go in opposite directions and they're out of control. Okay. And on the left, you have the lawnmower out of control, steering right ahead to a rare orchid. Oh no, the rare orchid is the last one left in the world, and it's about to bear seeds. So I don't know. Let's say it could produce stable, offspring. And then on the right, you have a lawnmower, and you look and you see it's heading towards a child. Oh no! So you have. Are you going to say the orchid or the child in this situation?
Yeah, I think these types of situations is exactly why I have a problem with this like super strict way of quantifying, because like, sorry, but we are also human beings, and like I don't believe that we can make this like perfect moral judgments in every kind of situation. I don't believe anyone does that, and if you do, you're probably gonna get so messed up from thinking like that. So yeah, as a human being, my instinct would probably be to save the child. That doesn't mean that I adhere to my moral theory, because maybe I'm not able as a human to live up to my moral theory in every instance of every day of my life. That might be the goal, and I might try generally to work towards that. But I think it's perfectly justified to also sort of follow the moral instincts in certain situations. And this is why, we generally do give more consideration to people that are close to us and stuff like that. And I think that's also okay. Like I don't believe in this kind of perfect way of looking at ethics, because the world and humans are so much more messy than that. So it's not realistic. Maybe I'd regret it afterwards that I didn't save the orchid, but I couldn't say that because it's not socially accepted.
So just to be clear, it's not that your moral theory requires inaction and deliberation. It's not that, but it's that you want to actually save the orchid. Is that right? So I'm just curious whether we should act, or at what stage the problem is occurring.
So I'm not sure I got that.
So I'm not sure. So you say that you would save the human, and I'm not sure and that might go against your moral your moral intuition, so some of your moral framework. I'm
Mhm.
wondering if that is because your moral framework requires inaction, so it requires thinking hard about things and deliberating things, or it and you know, just saying actually like the world is going to be the way the world is, or whether you actually think the orchid might be under your moral framework worth more. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if I get that those are the only two options, but in that case, I think it's more the latter, that the framework would say that if I would have time to like deliberately consider the whole situation, that maybe it would turn out that the orchid was almost equal more important. But it's it's about the action part. Like it doesn't call for inaction. Yeah, I'm not sure I got what you meant by that.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. It
Mm.
sounds like you can take actions upon your framework then.
Yes, definitely. I try to. I mean, what's really the case is just that it becomes way more complicated. Like in you know, every purchase I make and the decisions I make, I do try to think about all these things, but I have to think about a lot of different things, right? So I have to think about you know, what's the human input, what's the environmental footprint, what animals are suffering from this choice, and what's the role of that animal in the species. And so like it becomes very complicated. So that also makes it so much harder to quantify if I would approach it like that, right? So in a lot of situations, you have to kind of, you know, make your best bet. That's also the case in a lot of other more simply quantitative cases. But yeah, so I just try to take a lot of different considerations to factor them in when I make moral decisions. But I will also make a case for like, because I used to be way more, I used to like beat myself way more up about or like making different moral decisions all the time. So I want to make a case because I know that other people in Effektiv Altruisme are struggling with that too, that it's okay to like be human also. Like, I don't think it's a good thing for us to sort of push ourselves so far that, you know, it really affects your own well-being to like a great extent. It's not good if we have a community of like deeply depressed people who maybe then, you know, become inactive because it's so hard to act. Like there's a balance, and I personally been like way off on the other side before. I still am, but I'm trying to like be a little bit kinder to myself, and like it's okay to also have a life and try to, you know, try to be a good person, try and do the right thing, but don't beat yourself up in every single moral situation that you end up in. Yes. I have to get going, but yeah, it's the last question.
I think then as the time is nigh, all is said. Well, first of all, thank you, Andreas. Oh, all right, Timon, do you have time for one more question, Andrea?
Yes, a quick one.
A quick
Okay,
one. Quick one, Timon. Quick one.
I try to make it quick. So if you have several factors which you take into account for your moral decisions, in my head, it's kind of an evaluation matrix, right? You have different factors, but you still need to somehow, if subconsciously, weight them, right? You need to put a weight on those factors.
Yes.
And then the question is, how do you do it? I mean, there's big uncertainty, right? And I agree that it's good to not beat ourselves up, but in some way we need to, I mean, at least in my opinion, we need to quantify those factors to be able, even if we do it subconsciously, to be able to make a decision out of that.
Yes, I agree, and I do that too, of course. So as I said, like my point is not that we can't use quantitative methods at all, but just that they are, as you say, like they're kind of rough estimates, right? They're not like, we should be careful to use such estimates to make really like strong claims or, you know, admit that these are really based on just like how you feel or like what your intuitions are.
And
And
not
that's all
carve.
we can do, right? Like that's what we have. So yeah, no, I'm not opposed to that, and of course, obviously, I do that too.
So put weightings, but not carve them in stone.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes, philosophy as a tool and not a rule. I like this. All right. Well, Andrea, thank you so much for your time today. I think I've certainly enjoyed it. Villa put in the chat a lovely poem, which I'm going to end this all on. So then, thank you very much, Andrea. So from Emily Dickinson, the mountain sat upon the plain in his eternal chair, his observation on the fold, his inquest everywhere. The seasons prayed around his knees like children round a sir. Grandfather of the days is he, of dawn the ancestor. So on that, I thank everyone for coming. This has been an awesome EA Nordics event. Andrea, thank you for such an interesting perspective.
Thanks everyone. Feel free to reach out and continue conversations. Right.